My name is Courtney Copeland. 2015 is the biggest year of my life.
He was a ball of energy. Courtney was very energetic. He was loud. He was funny. He was a jokester.
My mom just came back from Wisconsin. She bought me this hat. Say Gucci. Gucci boy.
On the morning of March 4th, I heard this banging on my door. It startled me because it was just like boom, boom, boom. It's like somebody was trying to break down my door.
Family members say Copeland was on his way to a friend's house when he was shot through his car window. A bullet hit his back.
My heart is so filled with so much pain right now. I can't even comprehend it. But I wanted the world to know that today the heavens have gained an angel. And his name is Courtney.
Police don't work, the camera shows. Police don't work, the camera shows.
The first thing that I look at is what's on the paperwork, and I go through the file. And what's shocking to me, on page 3 of the report, it tells me my son was handcuffed and that my son was combative and violent. But they had already told me my son got out the car, told them he was shot, and he collapsed. So when did he become violent and combative that he needed handcuffs?
I'm excited, man. Reason why is because, I understand that I'm God's highest form of creation. And the things that I want and obtain in my life, I can do them. I just got to believe in myself.
I am black, beautiful, proud. I must be respected. I must be protected. I am somebody.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Betsy Reed, and I'm the editor-in-chief of The Intercept. It was back in March of 2020, in the early days of this global pandemic, that we released the Somebody podcast, a collaboration between The Intercept, Topic Studios, and the Invisible Institute. Somebody began when Shapearl Wells reached out to the Invisible Institute and asked their help to investigate the murder of her son, Courtney Copeland, a 22-year-old man who was found with a bullet in his back outside a Chicago police station in 2016 and died soon after. The resulting work is a powerful piece of audio journalism that documents Shapearl's quest for justice. Her voice and experiences are not only the emotional core of this podcast. She was a leading journalist driving this investigation alongside Alison Flowers of the Invisible Institute, who also served as a producer of the podcast. And we're honored tonight to have them both here for this conversation. With its unique mix of personal testimonial and brilliant storytelling, Somebody examines police accountability, racial justice, and public trust, issues that would finally take center stage in America following the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in the summer of 2020. From day one, we knew we had something special in our hands with this project. So despite the pandemic, we decided to keep to our release plans for the podcast. We were hoping that the world would pay attention and follow Shapearl's story, but we never imagined so many people would eventually respond in the way they did. A year later, Somebody has garnered rave reviews, has been downloaded over 1.5 million times, and it was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. It's also won dozens of journalism, podcasting, and media awards, including the prestigious National Magazine Award, the Scripps Howard Award, the Independent Documentary Association's Best Audio Documentary Prize, Adweek's Podcast Host of the Year, and the Gracie Award, among many other prizes. So it's a great honor to introduce Shapearl and Alison Flowers tonight. Shapearl Wells is a mother of 6 from Cicero, Illinois. She is vice president of the Courtney Copeland Memorial Foundation, which works to reduce violence, strengthen education, and build rapport between the community and police. In addition to being a journalist and producer at the Invisible Institute, Alison Flowers is the author of an award-winning book, Exoneree Diaries: The Fight for Innocence, Independence, and Identity. Tonight, they'll be talking about the impact of Somebody on Shapearl's life, on Courtney's case, and on the Chicago community at large. Special thanks to Maria Zuckerman, my colleague at Topic Studios, Roger Hodge at The Intercept, and Jamie Calvin, Bill Healy, and the entire team at the Invisible Institute. This isn't our first collaboration with Invisible Institute, and it certainly won't be the last. Now I'm going to turn it over to Alison Flowers and Shapearl Wells. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you so much, Betsy, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It has been quite a year from the podcast launching in the middle of a devastating pandemic to new and old questions about policing in this country. So let's get into it. Shapearl, how have you processed this past year? Catch us up.
I'm sorry, Allison, I missed your question. It was going in and out. Can you repeat it for me?
Okay, that's okay. I was asking you, how have you been this last year? How have you processed this last year with everything going on in the world, as well as just, with this podcast and the impact it's had?
Well, I've tried to process it as best as possible. Overall, the audience who has listened to the podcast have been wonderful. They have lifted my spirit so greatly with all of their warm letters and prayers and concerns. And just to have someone on the other end listening to the story of what happened to Courtney is pretty amazing. So the podcast, it came with a lot of accolades, and I greatly appreciate it. But most of all, I wanted the world to hear the story about Courtney.
And, that's something that we've been internally calling narrative justice, where other forms of justice have simply failed in this case. But most importantly, Shapearl, there have been some major changes to your family. Can you tell us about being a grandma for the first time?
Yes, I have a beautiful little grandson. His name is Justice. He is 4 months old, and he is my little sunshine, as I call him. And he has brightened our days. During this pandemic, everybody was worried about passing away, getting sick, and then God gave us new life in Justice. So, and he was named that because of what's going on with his uncle, as well as also he has Courtney's middle name. So, it brings us a lot of happiness.
Yeah, he's a bright light. I have had the privilege of meeting him. So, one big thing that happened this past year as a result of our reporting, the Inspector General of Chicago opened an official investigation into the Courtney Copeland case. And the Inspector General investigates misconduct among city agencies and officials. And it's all highly confidential. There's not a lot that they can tell us at this point. But, we're hoping for a robust report with findings and potential policy changes. Shapearl, you've been a part of this process. You've been interviewed, you've signed things. Can you just tell us what it's been like on your end and what your hopes are for this?
Well, I can tell you, like you said, it's a pretty secretive operation that they run because they're basically turning over every aspect of the case, from the initial investigation that the detectives on the scene did, as well as also the follow-up that they did with the potential witnesses. But most importantly, they're also focusing on Courtney being handcuffed, whether or not that he was indeed treated as a suspect, which we totally believe that he was, as opposed to a victim, because there was no reason whatsoever for Courtney to be handcuffed as he was dying.
And that was one thing that we wanted to talk about is, the fact that Courtney was handcuffed, but it's a fact that the city has denied in official documents, such as court documents, in response to a lawsuit that you had filed previously before it was withdrawn. And yet we also have city officials saying that Courtney was handcuffed for being combative or for his own safety. So it's such a huge contradiction there. And that was one thing that was pointed out on a Dateline episode that aired just a few days ago. So this past year, Shapearl and I have been busy shooting with Dateline, producing an episode about the case. Shapearl, how did you feel just a few days ago, last Friday, when that episode came out?
When Dateline actually aired, I was overwhelmed, I would say, because it was just like an emotional roller coaster. But I know that it gave the story, what happened to Courtney, a lot of notoriety. It basically told the whole world what happened to my son that night. And so what we're seeing now is that this is broadening the scope. So we have people across the world who has now heard the story of Courtney Copeland. And it also, even the podcast itself, we receive international letters, that we got a lot of letters over the weekend from people in Canada who watch Dateline. And so a lot of this is basic exposure, but we're hoping that this exposure not only for people to watch it, but also to move for change and for justice ultimately for Courtney, so that way we could actually move to different things. Because like you said, they have always denied the fact that they have handcuffed, but on the Dateline interview, they said that they handcuffed him due to his own safety. But when in all the paperwork, they have denied repeatedly that Courtney was ever handcuffed. So that was my first time ever hearing an official from Chicago Police Department actually admit to the fact that my son was handcuffed by one of their officers. And that has always been my fight, to find out why he was handcuffed, who handcuffed him, and who removed it. Because my son was dead, physically dead, at the time that the handcuffs were removed from him when he was at the hospital. So I just want people to understand that he was treated inhumanely in the final moments of his life.
And, paramedics don't even use handcuffs. So that was the thing that they pointed out. I know that there was something in the Dateline episode that we've already discussed that you wanted to point out because of some of the responses that you've been getting.
Yes. A lot of people have taken away from the Dateline episode that Alma may have actually been involved, maybe from her boyfriends or her exes that may have actually did the killing of Courtney Copeland. We actually, when we were doing our investigation, Alison, we actually overturned those rocks. We actually investigated all of her old boyfriends, as well as also we actually listened to the witnesses that actually gave great descriptions on the people that they thought may have actually done the crime. So when we left in our last meeting with CPD, we actually gave them a profile of 3 to 4 suspected people that were involved. Not only pictures, but we gave them mugshot and also their records, their criminal records. And we also tied together the case of how we think that this occurred. So I walked away, and I think that a lot of the audience walked away at Dateline thinking that the story leads to Alma. And I just wanted to be clear publicly that it does not lead to Alma. It leads to the 3 suspects that we provided to CPD that they failed to actually investigate. That's where we see the investigation going.
Right. And, since Dateline, a lot of people have been reaching out to the Invisible Institute as well, asking for help with their cases. And, seeing all of those notes really reminded me of when you first reached out to us, kind of when it all happened. And I'd like to introduce actually the first person who contacted you from the Invisible Institute. His name is Sam Stecklow. He played a critical role on the team, reporting and filing more than 80 public records requests in this case, which is just incredible. Sam, welcome. Thank you for everything that you did in this case. And can you tell us, Sam, what struck you about Shapearl and Courtney's story from the very beginning of all the inquiries that we receive?
Sure. Well, what struck me initially about Shapearl was her ability to go through all of the evidence that she'd amassed, which was by itself just incredibly impressive, and be able to very rationally synthesize the most pressing issues and questions about the case. I honestly can't begin to imagine what it's like having to be in that position and go through these records about your loved one or your son dying in this way, and going from having no investigative experience to putting together this narrative to convince us to take on the case and doing it just so incredibly well. And then aside from just being impressed by Shapearl, there were obviously so many inconsistencies and contradictions in the reports that she was able to identify, and those were all immediately red flag, and convinced me that this was a case that needed to be brought to your attention, and that we needed to take on and expand the thorough investigation that Shapearl had started.
And I think we actually have a clip from that very first phone conversation that we did not use in the podcast. So let's hear it.
The things when I was reading the Chicago Fire Department reports, we were trying to get as many reports as we possibly could. One of the reports says there was a copious amount of blood. And so that means that it's a lot of blood, but where is this blood found? Where is it? Mm-hmm. It's not in his vehicle. It wasn't on the scene. So where's the blood? And this is what they're describing in their report. But I have not shared this publicly with too many people, but also it's in the report from the Chicago Fire Department. It shows that my son was handcuffed, and they said that it says in their report that he became combative, and he was handcuffed. When he got to the emergency room, Courtney was still handcuffed, but he actually died 3 minutes before arriving to the hospital.
Uh-huh. So sorry, he there's in the fire department report, they're saying he got out of his car, went up to the sergeant. The sergeant agreed to take him to the hospital and then handcuffed him at some point in that process.
That's the unknown factor.
That phone conversation was from all the way back in 2017. And from there, Sam, you pursued the video, you obtained the video, so many other avenues, things that ended up in the podcast, things that didn't. I remember at one point you saw in a public records request the owner's manual for the surveillance pod camera that the police said had a DVR error, and this would have been a critical camera angle in the case. And so you sought the owner's manual in a public records request so that we could really dig into that issue. So Sam, you're really a master when it comes to public records requests, and it's just such a difficult system for the average citizen to navigate. So, we talk in investigations, there's a people trail and a paper trail. What sort of tips do you have for the average citizen who is trying to seek records and navigate the system as Shapearl has done?
So unfortunately, what information you're able to get, varies by where you live. It varies state by state. Some states have very restrictive laws around police records that prevent anyone, including the family of the victim, from accessing information. Thankfully, in Illinois, access to police records is relatively open. And while CPD was not particularly forthcoming with a lot of this information and took far longer than the law actually allows them to do, they didn't attempt to fight us on most of the requests. I think we had to file maybe 2 appeals of those 80-something requests. But obviously just getting the records isn't the end of the road. A large part of our investigation early on is reviewing and re-reviewing every piece of information we got, from the police reports to written detective notes to dispatch audio and video, and following up on everything and requesting new information, based on those records that we got. So not just the identities of the officers and the paramedics on the scene, but their disciplinary histories and employment histories, not just accepting an answer that a DVR had failed at face value, but putting in work to determine whether the CPD's explanation actually comports with the technical specifications of that device. And then, not just accepting an answer that, a seemingly related incident to Courtney's shooting had nothing to do with it, but following all of the clues to determine for ourselves whether it was related or not. And what an average citizen or, family member can expect is that, as in this case, it won't be laid out clearly or easily. The information will be broken up in ways that often doesn't make sense, or will reference documents that you don't have and you need to go ask for in a new request. But I would, an important thing is to never stop asking questions of the records that you receive until you're absolutely convinced there's nothing more to know. And in a lot of cases that, you won't ever get to that. level of being absolutely convinced. A lot of what you might get could end up not being useful, but you won't know until you're able to actually see it for yourself. You can also expect that even if the law allows for the release of records, some departments will try to withhold them under a variety of different exemptions to whatever state law you're in. Whenever you get a denial letter, you should examine everything that is being claimed. You should look up their legal citations, even if it reads very convincingly in their legalese. You should go over what the law says and how it's being interpreted by courts or other appellate bodies for records requests, depending on the state. That sounds very daunting, but resources exist to help with this. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press publishes extensive guides to access to government records for every state. And there's also the National Freedom of Information Coalition, which can help point you to state organizations in your state that may be able to help you respond to denials and draft appeals or point you to the information needed for you to proceed.
Thank you, Sam. So as you can see, it's just a very tricky road when it comes to seeking records. And if people ever have any questions about that, we do our best to respond to all inquiries, as we're doing right now as a result of the Dateline episode. Another development in this last year was our podcast teaching guide. I'd like to introduce Bill Healy. You may recognize his name as one of the creators and producers of the podcast, and he also appeared in a few scenes in the podcast as well. Bill, welcome. Can you tell us about the curriculum itself and describe it to us, and also why was it so important to put this out there this year of all years?
Sure. So the teaching guide is 10 lessons about the podcast, ranging from things like the role of media in making awareness of injustice more close to home for people. It's really meant for high school English students and high school civics students to engage with the material in the podcast. And, we felt like this year in particular, when a lot of students were stuck at home, they could access the transcripts from the podcast, they could access the audio online and on their phones. And, it was a way to keep the conversation that we started in the podcast going, but in the classroom.
And so far, how's it being received and used in Chicago?
Yeah, it's good. I spoke with one teacher who's got a class of 50 high school students in an English class in Waukegan. And, he's using it with his class. He said it was once they got into the classroom, the conversation flowed more easily than online. But, I think it takes a teacher who's willing to use this new medium of podcasting to use it as a text, the way you would, stuff from the past, the Scarlet Letter and Moby Dick and all of that. And to take Courtney's story and break it apart and think about who he is, not just as a person, but what his life was about and what's Shapearl's motivation, the conversation between police and Shapearl. Where does that conversation break down to really pull apart the storytelling, to pull apart the different aspects of it, and use that to further the conversation.
So people can find the teaching guide online. It's very useful as well because you have the transcripts and the script of the entire podcast to follow along. So some people may prefer to listen to the podcast that way as well. And we decided to demo the teaching guide with a very important cohort at the Invisible Institute, some VIP alums of the Youth Police Project. Thank you, Phil, for joining us. This Youth Police Project is a program that we've had for about 10 years in Chicago, and it was created by my colleague, Chaselyn Hunt. And she describes it as an extended listening or oral history experiment with high school students from the South Side about their regular encounters with Chicago police and how they feel safe moving about the world. And they, it's been such a rich and rewarding experience to learn from the kids. They listened to part of the podcast and they followed along with some of the discussion questions. And so we have a little clip from their conversation.
There's a lot of communities that are impacted by the police not doing their job or feel like, I haven't been served justice. My family hasn't been served justice. There's a lot of people out here with stories like that.
About how you ask, was she doing the right thing? About trying to investigate her son's death. I feel like she's on the right track because grief can tear you apart sometimes, you know.
I think this is her way of like dedicating it to him, basically, like trying to figure out what happened for him.
I feel like it is so much different for the young black man versus the young black woman. I had this conversation with my own father all the time. I feel like nobody come looking for us because they assume that don't nobody care about us. I say that to say, they assume we don't have fathers. They assume we don't have grandfathers. They assume we don't have like uncles.
Obviously, the people who care about you treat you like you're somebody. Somebody who's trying to hurt you gonna treat you like you're nobody.
Don't care to know where you're from.
To your family, like to your mom, that's my daughter. To your sister, that's my sister. Like your sister. So just imagine like losing that person. Like that's crazy. And then it's like people don't nobody look at it like, say my dog died. I'm gonna be sad. Y'all not gonna be sad because it ain't y'all dog, but it's my dog. Like I'm used to it. All of that.
I mean, but you can feel for
Yeah, you can feel for a person. You definitely can feel for a person. Definitely. Definitely, yeah.
Should the police feel for you? Is that what we want to do?
I think so. Yeah.
Serve and protect.
Serve and protect. That's their job.
And I feel like that's where the disconnect is. It didn't happen to them. This is their job. When I go home and I clock out, I'm going home. Versus this mom who restless nights 24/7, she looking for the killer who murdered her son. She don't get to clock out because she really want to know who killed my son. So it's definitely different.
If the police was how they is on TV, they got heart. Like they want to solve it. Yeah. They want to solve it. Like it's their job to get justice for this. It's his job to find this missing person. It's my job, and they don't. The episode ain't over until they do it, right? No respect. I think we don't have respect for them, and they don't have respect for us. Honestly, the police.
Oh, that's powerful. So, Shapearl, what's your reaction to hearing some of the commentary from the Youth Police Project?
I think that basically they hit the nail on the head. You know, a lot of what Black and brown people feel every day is that they don't see us. You know, we saw that that movie When They See Us about the Central Park 5, and they unfortunately treat us as if we are still 3/5 of a human being, and this is what we're seeing. And this is why I tell people that the policing issue is not going to change until the policing culture changes. It's not just, you know, CPD. This is nationwide that we're seeing this type of issue, no matter where we go, because it's the culture of policing. When we think about how policing started, it was basically to catch slaves. And so this is the history. It has always been to incarcerate and trap and demean Black and brown people. And so we see that this is just a carry on. And so when we think about what happened in Courtney's case and how he was surrounded by 8 cops who never assisted him in helping to apply pressure on his wound. You had the paramedics there who didn't physically touch him for 13 minutes. You know, these are things that are just, you know, as a mother, I can't fathom the desperation my son must have been feeling. And we see it on the video as he was begging them to help him. And so, you know, I just think that they understand, because it's a different reality if you're Black and brown in America. It just is.
And you were talking about police culture. One major takeaway from the podcast is this relatively uncommon police practice called scoop and run. So Shapearl, this was in episode 7, the final episode of the podcast. Would you mind just quickly reminding people what is scoop and run and why would it have potentially mattered in Courtney's case?
Yes, scoop and run is a practice that they have in Philadelphia where whoever arrives first, whether it be paramedics or police, they literally pick up gunshot victims, stabbing victims, and throw them in the back of the vehicle and take them to the nearest trauma center. And why this is important and why this would have possibly saved my son's life is that Courtney lay bleeding on the ground on the scene for 13 minutes without any medical intervention. Then they took him to the furthest hospital away from the scene, and where he could have actually probably gotten to Stroger Hospital or Mount Sinai within 5 or 10 minutes. And the reality is those decisions that the officers made, as well as also the EMTs made on that night, cost Courtney his life. At least they could have given him the chance to have an operation, to get into surgery, to try to save his life. But they made the decision to treat him as a suspect as opposed to a victim. And that ultimate decision cost my son his life.
So in Chicago, the practice of scoop and run, when police run a gunshot wound victim to the hospital in their own squad car, that is a practice that is allowed, but it's just not a part of the police culture here for the most part. However, there was a scoop and run that happened recently here in Chicago. 2 officers conducted one that saved a 13-year-old boy's life. We actually have a clip of video that was posted on social media, if we can take a look at that. Pardon all the emoticons. It was happening in real time.
Somebody was just shot. Officers doing what they can.
And so, when I saw the news, I thought of, Courtney's story, of course, but I also recognized one of the officers' names immediately. His name is Officer Julius Givens. And it turns out that he is actually the only unrepresented police officer out of the more than 13,000 Chicago police officers. Last year, in an open letter on Medium, he left the Fraternal Order of Police because the police union president had made comments about potentially expelling officers who chose to kneel beside peaceful protesters. And so Officer Givens wrote in his exit letter on Medium, I'm just going to read a quick excerpt. I believe the police must be steadfast and resolute in our support of community partners and organizations that stand for justice, peace, and healthy ideas that move our society forward. For example, those who peacefully protest that the color of their skin should not dictate a death sentence or abuse of power by the police aren't taking a political stand, but are crying out that they too have unalienable rights that should be protected. Moreover, these folks are not our enemies, or are they part of some deep state? Comparatively, they seek justice, tranquility, liberty, and prosperity for themselves and their children, all things we are constitutionally bound to uphold. So this is the same officer who participated in that scoop and run. And I actually had a chance to speak with him last week, and we're going to see that video now. First, Officer Givens did want me to say that the views represented do not represent the Chicago Police Department or any of its other members. So we can go ahead and hear from him now.
We find this boy, 13 years old, laying in this backyard right outside this alley with some pretty severe gunshot wounds. And knowing that time was of the essence, we pick him up and we self-deliver him to Comer's Children's Hospital.
You felt free to do that? Like you knew you were allowed to do it? Were you trained to do it? Like how did you make that decision, or was it all instinct, just like kind of?
I would say it was all instinct. I'll be honest with you, I don't know if we were allowed to do it. I hadn't read a general order that encouraged or encouraged that or not. The reality was this kid needed to be transported to a hospital 30 seconds ago. So the priority was getting him there. When a patient is shot, the priority is stopping that bleeding. And if that saves a child's life or any human life, I think there's a respect for those police officers as a consequence. There's a trust for those police officers. Our number one priority is the sanctity of human life, right? And when it's evident that you've put someone's life or made someone's life a priority, I think there's a greater appreciation from the community as a consequence to that.
Shapearl, how does that How do those words hit your ear when you hear him talking about the sanctity of life?
I mean, that's what every mom wants. You know, I often talk about how I wish any of those officers on the scene had imagined Courtney was their child. And when I hear this particular officer, I imagine that he felt, this is my child. I'm going to do whatever I can to save this child's life. And that's what he did. Because if you put no one wants to bury a child. No one wants to. And we see in this reality that this type of trauma needs immediate attention. And that's what I would expect any officer to do. But I noticed something about him, that he was a Black officer. I don't know if it would have been the same if he was a white officer, if they would have had that same sense of urgency to save this child's life. I think that if we have more Black officers and more even brown officers in the mix, we know that that it's very limited in the racial disparities in policing. And so we need people of color to help serve and protect our community so that way they can help save our lives if we're in trouble.
Well, maybe you and Officer Gibbons can meet and talk. I'm sure you'd have quite a lot to discuss. So finally tonight, we're going to hear from two of Courtney's high school pals that are here, Frances McDonald and Benny Hernandez Ocampo. Welcome. They went to Jones High School with Courtney. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Frances, what do you remember about Courtney?
Well, Gucci was the popular guy at Jones. Everyone knew and loved him. His energy and his laughter was so contagious. When I was a freshman, he was a junior, and so there was really no reason for him to be nice and cool to me, but he always was. Always said what's up in the hallways, always cracking jokes with me, just a fantastic human who's always made me feel included when I was at Jones.
Benny, how about you?
Well, Courtney was life. I played basketball with him. Summer workouts. He was hilarious. He was the definition of a hustler on and off the court. And he would always joke around with me, just laughing and joking, talking about how me and Frances would actually end up together one day. And here we are. And that just kind of speaks to the kind of person he was, so he was life.
Well, it kind of came full circle because I originally know Frances not as Courtney's high school friend, but as a colleague with whom I've investigated wrongful conviction cases at the Invisible Institute. I've driven all over Illinois with Frances. We went to a prison. We've done a prison interview together, which is always a very emotional experience. So Frances, tell me what it was like when you found out that the Invisible Institute had taken on your friend's case.
Well, Alison, you were there and you saw that I completely broke down. I was really shocked, to be honest. I was just coming to work. I really wasn't expecting anything from my personal life to end up right at work. And then also when you told me everything, it came rushing back. March 4th, the funeral, everything. And I realized that I also had never fully grieved. But I was also really caught off guard when you told me that there was a potential police misconduct angle to the case and that he could have been helped. And I didn't know that before you told me that at that time. And that was honestly the most overwhelming and most painful part about it.
And I just want to acknowledge and thank both of you because you contributed to the podcast in really meaningful ways. Benny, you were one of our translators for a very key interview with two witnesses, Elena and Edgar. And, why did you want to give back and help us out on this case?
Well, it was real easy. I did feel a small sense of responsibility to help out. But Courtney has a whole city on his back supporting him. And I'm just happy that I was able to do my small, tiny part in helping. And real quick, Shapearl, I just want to say I'm so sorry. And God bless you and your family. Courtney was amazing. And you truly are an inspiration. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And, just hearing how much impact he made to a lot of his friends and family. He always told me, I used to always say, Courtney, you need to sit down. You're always running around all the time. And he's like, Mom, I'm out here changing lives. And in his death, I realized that he was impacting and touching and pouring life into so many people. And I just thank God for that gift that God gave him to be a life to a lot of people. He was life.
Yes. Well, thank you for giving him to all of us. Yes.
Francis and Benny, thanks so much for sharing with us tonight. That concludes our event. Thank you all for joining us. Before we go, a few final words from someone who has really championed our work on the podcast these last few years.
Hi. Thank you so much, Alison and Shapearl. I'm Maria Zuckerman, head of Topic Studios. Our team produced Somebody along with The Intercept and the Invisible Institute. We're honored that Shapearl shared her journey with all of us, and we're incredibly proud to be a part of this important podcast, along with iHeartRadio and Tenderfoot TV. And moving on to something that is new from our team at First Look Media, one of the wonderful things about doing this podcast was that we were able to work with our First Look Media colleagues at The Intercept. We have a new collaboration, this time launching on Audible, called American ISIS. American ISIS is hosted by investigative journalist Trevor Aronson. This Audible original documentary podcast tells the extraordinary story of Russell Dennison, an American ex-convict and Muslim convert who traveled to Syria to fight for the Islamic State. Please take a listen to the trailer.
I'm not speaking on behalf of the Islamic State or speaking for them, but I'm speaking about my life, and I would like to record...
Russell Dennison was an American who joined the Islamic State, or ISIS, as a fighter in Syria.
But if this information was to be released while I am alive, it could potentially make a very dangerous situation for me with the security forces.
I'm Trevor Aronson. For months, Russell secretly communicated with me, telling me about his conversion to Islam, his life in the United States, and his journey to the Middle East, and ultimately, to the world's most feared terrorist organization.
So as soon as we were walking across the border, you could hear the bombs, the missiles, the bullets, everything, the tanks. So I thought to myself, Allahu Akbar, where am I going? And there's no turning back.
Russell's recordings provide an astonishing first-hand account of what it was like for an American in the Islamic State. From The Intercept and Topic Studios, this is American ISIS, an Audible original.
We're so excited to share this story. It premieres on July 15th. You can go to audible.com/American ISIS to hear all 8 episodes. Thanks again to everyone for joining today, and a special thank you to Shapearl and Alison and Betsy Reed and all of our guests. If you have not yet listened to Somebody, you can access it on The Intercept, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please be on the lookout for American ISIS on July 15th. Thank you so much.